are a member of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the largest union in Canada and New Brunswick. Every day, 20,000 CUPE workers like you provide services that affect every person in this province. Standing strong together, we have the power to protect our collective bargaining rights. This power did not come easily. Many struggles were fought over our working conditions, benefits, wages, pensions, and job security. Battles to ensure we were able to provide adequately for our families. At one time, it was against the law to come together and even discuss forming unions. It was called seditious conspiracy. Those workers who joined together faced deportation without hearing, often greeted with armed thugs at the plant gates. With raw determination and conviction, they stood strong against the law to change the way of life for workers in Canada. They stood the test. The right to form a union with free collective bargaining became part of Canadian society. The union movement is deeply entrenched in New Brunswick. Some of the first unions in Canada began here. Our determination and conviction have been tested time and time again. In 1918, the Army was brought in after the City of St. John fired every police officer who stood together to form a union. They did not give up. Instead, they gathered signatures from property owners to recall council. The new council hired them back. A year later, they became the first police union in North America. We stood the test. Just one example of the many battles waged to ensure collective bargaining rights in Canada. Longtime union leader Lofty McMillan remembers this well.
What they have today is because of the nights and the days and the weeks and the lobbying and the picketing and the pressure that was put on by the public employees. They have that today. Well, you can't let the clock be turned back. The workers have to say enough is enough. You draw the line.
It was the grit and determination of those who came before us that forced governments and employers to recognize unions as part of our democracy. However, the right to belong to a union with free collective bargaining has been more tolerated than accepted by governments and employers.
Tomorrow, the Government of Canada will ask Parliament for the authority to impose severe restraint upon rising prices and incomes.
Labor is outraged at the wage and price controls program. In the past, unions negotiated directly with their employers. Now government will dictate their wage increases. Workers know they will pay. Inflation will be fought on their backs.
In 1976, we did not meet the test. Union members in some cities walked off the job for a day. That was not enough to stop government from imposing wage rollbacks and resulting in showing government and employers they could interfere with free collective bargaining through legislation. And interfere they did, again in 1991. The New Brunswick government passed legislation that replaced negotiated settlements with a wage freeze that affected over 50,000 New Brunswick workers, including those at the universities and municipalities.
For the first time in the history of New Brunswick, the government introduced legislation in April of 1991 breaking signed legal contracts, taking $65 million from workers' paychecks.
Pleasure once that Bill number 73 be now read a second time. For it, yea. Against it, nay. Carried.
A day for democracy was declared, and 10 days after the CUPE convention, the biggest demonstration in the history of New Brunswick was held at the legislature.
Enough is enough! Enough is enough! Enough is enough!
Major demonstrations, a massive public relations campaign, one-day withdrawal of services. It was not enough. The legislation stood. The government even threatened to introduce back-to-work legislation against the private sector in an effort to stop a strike by the mine workers in Bathurst.
What this meant to us in 1991, if they could legislate our rights away in the private sector, they definitely could do it to any union in any sector. The message is if they can legislate collective bargaining rights away from one group, they can definitely legislate for all groups.
To achieve this target, Negotiated wage increases that were delayed last year would have to be delayed again or altered.
Having got away with the wage freeze legislation, like any bully, the government attacked. It introduced legislation to interfere with free collective bargaining and forced a second year of no wage increase. Again, we were tested. CUPE New Brunswick put a plan of action in place to stop the legislation that interfered with free collective bargaining. 20,000 CUPE workers went on a provincial general strike, the biggest in our history.
20,000 members of CUPE started the day angry and frustrated with the government they say has broken its word. They were geared up for a fight, and they weren't afraid to yell their insults right at Premier Frank McKenna.
Someone's got to take a stand against the McKenna government, and I guess it's us that's got to do it.
The Labor Relations Act states the union shall be decertified. But even the warnings do not seem to be influencing the strike vote. Carol Adams, CBC News, Fredericton.
Other provincial governments forced legislation on their workers. Prince Edward Island legislated a 7.5% wage rollback. Newfoundland legislated a 7-year wage freeze. Our premier thought he could do the same, with threats of mass firings, a $27 million lawsuit, and union decertification.
This union, CUPE in New Brunswick, really represents the only union virtually in Canada that's been unable to accept the reality of the financial times. All across the country, people have accepted restraint packages more severe than ours.
CUPE members stood strong. The legislation interfering with free collective bargaining was defeated.
CUPE leaders from across the province gathered this afternoon at the Fredericton Hotel, where their negotiators hammered out a tentative agreement.
In 1992, CUPE members were united, and the government knew it. The legislation interfering with free collective bargaining was never proclaimed. We stood the test. With the success of 1992, we were able to stop more legislative threats. In 1995, the government backed off legislation that would severely weaken the collective bargaining power of municipal employees. With a new government come new challenges for workers and their families. In 2000, court stenographers were forced on a lengthy strike that lasted 133 days before reaching a fair settlement. The next winter, the government introduced Bill 30, legislating an end to the hospital workers' strike. That summer, threats were again made to introduce back-to-work legislation to end the nursing home strike. Brick by brick, CUPE New Brunswick has built a wall of solidarity over the last 3 years, a movement to stop the big stick government interference with free collective bargaining. It has not been easy, but our members have proven that in solidarity there is power. Our school district workers, Local 1253, were threatened with back-to-work legislation. Local 1418, our rehabilitation and therapy members, got a negotiated settlement during their strike because we joined together and convinced government they could not get away with back-to-work legislation. During the 2003 provincial strike of Local 1251, our corrections officers, custodians, human services counselors, again, the Premier made public threats of bringing in legislation to force their settlement on our members. CUPE New Brunswick's plan of action and solidarity pact worked. The government negotiated a settlement with Local 1251. Last fall, the government formed the Resource Maximization Committee to review every department. This backroom committee wanted to cut spending and contract out more services, like custodians and bus drivers. Now, the Premier is threatening to contract out our jobs in hospitals and other public services. Legislated settlement, wage freezes, rollback, and contracting out are back on the books yet again. That's because the Lord government is following the government trends across Canada.
For the last 2 years, we've been dealing with the legacy of this government's breaking a legally binding contract. By smashing our collective agreement 2 years ago, it freed them up to fire workers, to close hospitals, to close services.
2 years ago, 7,000 hospital jobs in British Columbia were contracted out at half wages and no benefits because the government brought in legislation that tore the no contracting out and job security articles from their collective agreements. This was because the British Columbia labor movement did not join together to stop the legislation, and the bullying tactics continued. Last year, the BC government brought in back-to-work legislation against private sector woods and mill workers who were on strike. This year, the BC government brought in legislation rolling wages of hospital workers back 15%. The planned one-day strike was not enough to stop legislation, and the mobilization crumbled.
This is about communities throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. This is about survival of the public service in this great province as ours.
In Newfoundland, back-to-work legislation ended a month-long legal strike by 20,000 members. The government made profit during that strike, over $60 million. We saw the coffins representing the death of free collective bargaining. In Quebec, the government introduced legislation interfering with job security, paving the way for more contracting out. New Brunswick politicians are getting lessons from these provinces on how to divide and destroy the collective bargaining rights of workers. The same government that wants to destroy free collective bargaining and force our members to accept little or no wage increases think nothing of giving all MLAs a whopping increase for every committee meeting they attend. It amounts to a 28% increase for MLAs outside Fredericton and 67% for those living in the capital area. One day, 2 committee meetings, and an MLA collects a